Did you feel like you were actually hunting human beings?
Well, I was. You wouldn't call that hunting them?
In the unforgiving world of the criminal justice system, where hardened criminals come face to face with the consequences of their actions, death row inmates often count down the rest of their days with a mix of anxiety and resolution. These aren't ordinary criminals, but serial killers, sadistic murderers, and unrepentant offenders deserving of the maximum penalty.
Defendant has 30 days from the issuance of a mandate from the Supreme Court of Florida affirming the sentence of death.
What happens when these death row inmates reach their final countdowns and stand at the end of their journey? Join us as we showcase the most disturbing last footage of death row inmates. Kenneth Eugene Smith. At 8:25 p.m. on the 25th of January, 2024, 28-year-old Kennedy Smith was led into the execution room at Holman Correctional Center faculty. Strapped to an execution bed by the guards, Kennedy's nose was covered with a gas mask with nitrogen hypoxia suffocating him to death. Now get this method of execution has never been used before. So how did we get here? It all started on March 1988, when the sheriff's office got a tearful and trembling call from a pastor. This call prompted the whole office staff and police officers on their feet and ready for a quick response because a woman had been killed. The caller was a pastor named Charles Sennett, who reported that he got home to find his house very messy, as though someone had broken into the house and was searching for items maybe to steal. Then he found his wife, Elizabeth Sennett, lying lifeless on the floor with multiple stabbed wounds and a big pipe lying next to her. Elizabeth and her husband, Reverend Charles Sennett, had been married for 26 years, and they had 2 sons, Chuck and Mike. The Sennett family is known for their liveliness and kindness in the community in Alabama, so the obvious question on everyone's mind was, why would anyone commit such a grievous sin? Here is a twist no one saw coming. The murder was orchestrated by Elizabeth's husband, Charles Sennett himself. Surprising, right? But why would he do such? Charles Sennett, the pastor at the Westfield Church of Christ, was living a double life. He was having an affair with a church member with whom he kept nagging about how he didn't love his wife anymore and wanted to be with her. Not only that, Charles was heavily in debt of up to $200,000, so to sort out his misery, he put out a life insurance policy on his wife, planning to use the payout to settle his debts. To carry out the murder, Charles borrowed $3,000 from his girlfriend and took it to a man named Billy Greg Williams, who was his tenant, asking him to do a clean job. Billy then passed the job to Kenneth Eugene Smith and another man, John Forrest Parker, promising them a share of the insurance money Charles promised him. On March 18, 1988, Kenneth Eugene Smith and John Forrest Parker went to Elizabeth Sennett's home and brutally attacked her. She was beaten and stabbed multiple times, leading to her death. The crime scene was staged to look like a burglary gone wrong. The investigation into Elizabeth Sennett's murder initially pointed to a robbery, but as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the murder-for-hire plot. The detectives kept their hands on deck, watching for loopholes, and that was when they noticed Charles had withdrawn a huge sum from their insurance just a few days after his wife's death, which was quite abnormal for a grieving husband. Further investigation pointed to Kenneth, and it didn't take long for him to mention John and Billy's names. Charles Sennett, fearing arrest, he unalived himself a week after the murder. But as for Kenneth Eugene Smith, Billy Gray Williams, and John Forrest Parker, they were found guilty of capital murder. Billy was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, but Kennedy and John were sentenced to death for their roles in the brutal killing of Elizabeth Sennett. Following their convictions, Kenneth and John filed numerous appeals, challenging various aspects of their trials and sentences. These appeals spanned for over 35 years, but ultimately failed to overturn their death sentences. Billy Gray Williams was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and died in prison on November 2020. John was executed by lethal injection on June 2010. In November 2022, Kenneth was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection, but the execution couldn't take place because the execution team was unable to connect the intravenous lines to Kenneth in the time available before the expiration of the death warrant issued by the Alabama Supreme Court. So as part of a settlement between the state and Kenneth, the state agreed not to pursue his execution by lethal injection, which is the default primary method of execution in Alabama. The method of execution for Kenneth Eugene Smith became a subject of controversy. Nitrogen hypoxia, a relatively new and untested method, involves depriving the individual of oxygen by having them breathe pure nitrogen. This method was proposed as an alternative to lethal injection, which had faced legal and logistical challenges. In nitrogen hypoxia, the condemned person is placed in a sealed chamber or fitted with a mask that delivers pure nitrogen. Without oxygen, the person loses consciousness and eventually dies from lack of oxygen. The use of nitrogen hypoxia has sparked significant debate. Proponents argue that it is a more humane method of execution, potentially causing less pain and suffering than lethal injection or other methods. Critics, however, argue that it is untested by humans and could lead to unforeseen complications or prolonged suffering. Kenneth Eugene Smith's execution by nitrogen hypoxia marked one of the first uses of this method in the United States. The execution drew considerable media attention and public scrutiny. Smith's execution was carried out in accordance with the state's protocol for nitrogen hypoxia, and he was pronounced dead shortly after the process began. Joseph Paul Franklin, a mentally troubled man from an abusive, broken home, turned radical racist and then serial killer. This is the story of Joseph Paul Franklin, an American serial killer, white supremacist, and domestic terrorist who engaged in a murder spree from the late 1970s and early 1980s. Born James Clayton Vaughn, Jr., Franklin was drawn to white supremacist ideologies from a young age. He would eventually change his name to reflect his admiration for Benjamin Franklin and Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels. He was the eldest son of James Clayton Vaughn, Sr., and Helen Rao Vaughn. His father was a World War II veteran and butcher, and an alcoholic who usually spent months, if not years, away from his family, then returned to physically abuse his children. On the other hand, his mother Helen was a strict and abusive woman, and was said by Franklin himself to have never really cared about him or his siblings, who were given rarely enough to eat. Later on, Franklin would say that his dysfunctional childhood affected his emotional development so that he practically was 10 years or more behind other people in their maturity. While in school, Franklin did poorly as a student, while developing an interest in evangelical Christianity. He later dropped out after an accident left his eyesight severely impaired, which exempted him from military conscription. In 1968, he got married twice, first with Bobby Lee Dorman, and then with Anita Carden in 1979. His first marriage lasted 4 months, while the second one lasted 1 year. Bobby Dorman, his first wife, said she would sometimes find him weeping for no apparent reason. During his teens, he had come into contact with far-right and neo-Nazism, joining the National Socialist White People's Party, and after his mother died in 1972, the segregationist movement. After moving to Atlanta, he enlisted in the National States' Rights Party, along with the local Ku Klux Klan. Within those groups, he started to dislike the fact that all most of his fellow members seemed to want to do was talk, while he was ready to take action. The summer of 1976 marked a turning point in his life. Over Labor Day weekend in Atlanta, Franklin followed an interracial couple and sprayed them with mace, becoming his first known physical attack. This incident would escalate into a horrific killing spree. In 1976, he wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter, threatening to kill him for his pro-civil rights views. Franklin would later state that he decided to start a race war after reading a copy of Mein Kampf, while also claiming to have been inspired by Charles Manson's Helter Skelter. On July 25, 1977, Franklin bombed the Rockville, Maryland, home of Jewish lobbyist, attorney, and at the time executive director of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, Morris J. Amitay. The family managed to escape alive, but their house dog was killed in the explosion. 4 days later, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, he firebombed and destroyed the Beth Shalom synagogue, though there were no injuries. On August 7, 1977, Franklin shot a young interracial couple, Alphonse Manning, Jr., and Tony Schwen, in a Madison, Wisconsin parking lot. Almost 2 months later, he shot at people attending services at a St. Louis, Missouri synagogue, leaving 42-year-old Gerald Gordon unalive, while 2 others were left wounded. For the next 3 years, Franklin drifted across the country, robbing banks and using a sniper rifle to target his victims. February 2, 1978, Franklin shot and killed Johnny Brookshire and wounded his white wife, Joy Williams. On March 6, he shot Hustler publisher Larry Flint and his lawyer, Gene Reeves, in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Flint was left permanently crippled by the shooting. Franklin later said he did it in retaliation for Hustler depicting interracial sex. On July 29th, again in Chattanooga, he shot and killed a black man, William Bryant Tatum, and injured his white girlfriend, Nancy Hilton. On July 12, 1979, in Doraville, Georgia, he shot and killed black Taco Bell manager Harold McIver for being in close contact with white women. On August 8, he shot and killed Raymond Taylor, a 28-year-old black man who was sitting inside a Falls Church, Virginia Burger King. Also, on October 21st, he killed yet another interracial couple, Jesse Taylor and Marion Brissett, in the parking lot of an Oklahoma City shopping center. On December 5th, he shot to death a 15-year-old sex worker named Mercedes Lynn Master, whom he briefly lived with in DeKalb County, Georgia. Franklin would later say he did it because she had African-American customers. While in Indianapolis, Franklin shot and killed 2 black males, Lawrence Reese and Leo Watkins, on the 12th and 14th of January, 1980. On the 3rd of May, he shot to death a young white hitchhiker, Rebecca Bergstrom, dumping her body near Tomah in central Wisconsin. On May 29th in Fort Wayne, Indiana, civil rights activist and Urban League president Vernon Jordan was shot and seriously wounded while in the company of a white woman. Franklin at first denied being responsible for the attempt and was acquitted, though he later confessed. He also admitted having planned to kill another civil rights activist named Julian Bond before murdering Jordan. On June 8th, he shot and killed Darrell Lane and his cousin, Dante Evans, in Cincinnati. On June 15th, he shot an interracial couple, Arthur Smothers and Kathleen McCula, in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. 10 days later, in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, he picked up 2 white hitchhikers, Nancy Santomero and Vicky Durian, and brought them to a wooded area where he shot them both to death. Franklin would later claim he decided to do it after one of the young girls said she had a black boyfriend. On August 20th, he shot 2 black joggers, Ted Fields and David Martin, as they were leaving a Salt Lake City park with 2 white women. Franklin's mission, as he later described it, was to incite his fellow white supremacists to action. He had rejected even the most radical hate groups, believing they didn't take their hatred far enough. Franklin wanted to actively attack, not just sit around complaining. The FBI and its partners were eventually able to close in on Franklin, but it took time. The vast distances between his crimes and his skill at living as an anonymous drifter kept him under the radar for a while. This changed in September 1980 when a police officer in Kentucky noticed a gun in the back of Franklin's car during a routine stop. A records check revealed an outstanding warrant, leading to Franklin's arrest. Evidence from the car linked Franklin to the racially motivated sniper attacks across the country. The FBI's behavioral analysts contributed crucial insights, and the Bureau shared its growing knowledge of Franklin's characteristics and tactics with law enforcement and the public. 2 details proved especially important: Franklin's racist tattoos and his reliance on blood bank donations for cash. On September 25, 1908, he was arrested in Florence, Kentucky, but managed to escape from custody through a police department window. However, he was eventually recaptured almost a month later after a blood bank operator in Florida contacted the FBI about a man matching Franklin's description. Agents immediately tracked him to Lakeland, Florida, and arrested him on October 28, 1980. Over the next 2 decades, Franklin faced legal action across the U.S. for his crimes. He was eventually convicted of multiple murders, attacks, and other offenses at both the state and federal levels. Franklin was sentenced to life in prison and received the death penalty in several states. He began to serve his life sentences in the United States Penitentiary of Marion, Illinois, and report has it that he was stabbed by a group of African-American inmates. Later on, in 1997, despite attempts from the defense to argue that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and despite an attempted escape by Franklin himself, he was sentenced to death for the murder of Gerald Gordon in Missouri. In the same year, he was sentenced to 40 years of imprisonment for the murders of Darrell Lane and Dante Brown. Then, in 1998, he was resentenced to yet another 2 concurrent life sentences for the murder of William Tatum. Franklin was injected with a lethal dose of pentobarbital at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic, and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri, on November 20th, 2013. He didn't make any final statement, but 3 days prior, he revealed to a local newspaper he had renounced his racist views and that he considered black people people just like us. Now it's time for our subscribers' pick. This image depicts one of the most disturbing last footage of Death Row Inmates. Here, a prisoner in an orange jumpsuit, restrained and surrounded by guards with a caption reading, "Please don't do it." This scene captures the intense moment before an execution, highlighting the prisoner's desperation and fear. Execution methods for serial killers and other capital offenders have varied over time and across jurisdictions. Historically, methods such as hanging, the electric chair, firing squad, and gas chambers have been used. More recently, lethal injection has become the most common method in the United States, although it has faced scrutiny due to botched executions and legal challenges. This image underscores the emotional and ethical complexities surrounding capital punishment. It reflects the fear and humanity of those facing execution, raising questions about the morality and effectiveness of the death penalty. Some states and countries have sought alternative methods, like nitrogen hypoxia used on Kenneth Eugene Smith, to address concerns about the suffering caused by traditional execution methods. This ongoing debate continues to shape public opinion and legal standards regarding the use of capital punishment for serial killers and other serious offenders. Now it's your turn. Tell us in the comments section, what do you think about these capital form of punishment? Williams Wilkerson. It was a chilly May morning in 1879 in the Utah Territory when the condemned man, Wallace Wilkerson, was led out to the jail yard to face his executioners. Wilkerson, a 24-year-old Mormon from Quincy, Illinois, had been convicted of murdering a man in a card game dispute 2 years earlier. Now, after countless appeals, his time had finally come. As Wilkerson came out from the jailhouse, his step was firm and his expression resolute. Dressed in a black suit and white felt hat, he carried a lit cigar in his left hand, determined to meet his fate head-on. The spectacle drew a crowd of nearly 24 onlookers, who murmured anxiously as the condemned man took his place in the chair that had been set up in the corner of the yard. The sheriff pleaded with Wilkerson to allow himself to be strapped into the chair and accept a blindfold, as was customary. But the defiant prisoner refused. "I give you my word. I intend to die like a man, looking my executioners right in the eye," he declared. Relenting, the sheriff instead placed a white 3-inch square patch over Wilkerson's heart as a target for the firing squad. At the sheriff's signal, 4 riflemen stepped out from a nearby shed and took aim at their mark. Wilkerson drew himself up tall in the chair, bracing for the fatal volley. "Ready, aim," came the muffled command. Then the sound of gunshot erupted in a thunderous report that echoed through the yard. But something had gone horribly wrong. As the smoke cleared, the spectators looked on in horror as Wilkerson, instead of slumping lifeless in the chair, leapt up and stumbled forward several feet, clutching his left arm. "Oh my God! They have missed it!" he shrieked. A doctor and several witnesses rushed to Wilkerson's aid as he writhed on the ground. It soon became clear that the shooters had misfired. Their bullets had struck high and wide of the target. 3 of the slugs had torn into Wilkerson's upper body, but none had hit his heart. The 4th bullet had shattered his left arm, but left him still clinging to life. For a full 24 agonizing minutes, Wilkerson lay there suffering, his cries of pain echoing across the jail yard. It was only then that the attending physician could finally pronounce him dead. One witness from the Ogden Junction newspaper sarcastically remarked that the French guillotine never fails, a biting jab at the incompetence of this gruesome execution. This was not the first time that a botched execution had occurred in the Utah Territory. In 1951, a condemned man named Eliseo Maris had met a similarly horrific fate when he was executed at the new state prison. Though the details were kept sparse in the newspaper reports at the time, it was later revealed that 2 of the 4 bullets fired at Mares had merely struck his hip and abdomen, leaving him to die a slow, agonizing death. As methods like firing squads and hangings became more widely used, the potential for things to go catastrophically wrong became ever more apparent. The spectacle of men writhing in pain and terror, struggling against the Reaper's scythe, challenged the notion that the state could carry out death sentences in a clean, clinical manner. For Wilkerson, his final moments was the stuff of nightmares. Trapped in the chair, helpless as the bullets tore into his body, he was forced to endure an excruciatingly prolonged demise as the bungling executioners struggled to finish the job. His plaintive cries for mercy, his desperate bid to die like a man, only heightened the macabre horror of the scene. The gruesome fate that befell both Wilkerson and Mares shone a harsh light on the inherent flaws of capital punishment. In the wake of these scandals, the moral and practical questions surrounding the death penalty only grew more acute. Was it truly justice to subject condemned men to such cruel and unusual punishments? Or was it merely state-sanctioned vengeance, with all the messiness and inhumanity that entailed? As the public recoiled at the grisly details, support for capital punishment began to wane, setting the stage for its eventual abolition in Utah and across much of the United States. The executions of Wallace Wilkerson and Eliseo J. Mares stood as stark testaments to the dangers of unchecked state power. Their horrific deaths laid bare the inherent flaws and moral quandaries at the heart of the death penalty, a system that claimed to deliver justice, but too often descended into barbarism. William Kemmler. William Kemmler was an American peddler, alcoholic, and murderer who, in 1890s, became the first person in the world to be executed by electric chair. He was convicted of murdering his common-law wife, Matilda Tilly Ziegler. Although electrocution had been successfully used to kill a horse prior to Kemmler's execution, his own execution did not go smoothly. Kemmler was born in 1860 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Both of his parents were German immigrants and were also alcoholics. After dropping out of school at age 10, unable to read or write, Kemmler worked in his father's butcher shop. His father died from an infection received after a drunken brawl, and his mother died from complications of alcoholism. In the late 1870s, Kemmler was reportedly slender with dark brown hair. He spoke both English and German. After his parents' deaths, he went into the peddling business and earned enough money to buy a horse and cart. But he also became a heavy drinker. In one incident, after a series of drunken binges, Kemmler claimed he could jump his horse and cart over an 8-foot fence. The attempt failed, resulting in the destruction of his cart and goods. Kemmler was known to his friends as Philadelphia Billy, and his drinking binges were well known around the saloons in his Buffalo neighborhood. The execution of William Kemmler on August 6, 1890, is one of the disturbing last footage of death row inmates you'd come across on the internet. On that fateful day, the state of New York made history by becoming the first to employ a novel method of capital punishment. The electric chair. Proponents of electrocution, including the renowned Thomas Edison, had long touted the procedure as the solution to the perceived inhumanity of other execution methods, like hanging or firing squads. They promised that electricity would provide a quick, effective, and above all, painless death, a proof of the power of scientific progress to transform even the grimmest of tasks. Yet when the moment of truth arrived for Kemmler, a man described as intellectually disabled, the reality proved to be anything but the sanitized vision peddled by electrocution's supporters. As Kemmler sat strapped into the chair, he reportedly told the corrections officers, "Don't let them experiment on me more than they ought to." The initial 17-second jolt of high-voltage current did not kill Kemmler instantly as promised. Instead, witnesses recoiled in horror as the condemned man let out a deep groan, and the execution chamber filled with the nauseating stench of burning flesh. Desperate cries rang out to "turn on the current" as 2 witnesses fainted and several others succumbed to severe attacks of nausea. Kemmler's execution was described as a historic bungle that was disgusting, sickening, and inhuman. The gruesome spectacle had laid bare the lie at the heart of electrocution's selling points, shattering the illusion of a quick, painless death. Yet despite this inauspicious debut, the electric chair would go on to play a central role in American capital punishment for decades to come. In the years since Kemmler's execution, states have carried out 158 more electrocutions, with 10 of them identified as botched. The enduring legacy of the electric chair is a complex and often unsettling one, inextricably linked to the broader history of the death penalty in the United States. Even as public sentiment has shifted away from electrocution in recent years, with many states abandoning the practice in favor of lethal injection, the specter of the electric chair looms large. In a cruel irony, the very arguments used to justify electrocution's introduction, its speed, effectiveness, and ostensible painlessness, would later be repurposed to support other methods of execution, from lethal injection to nitrogen gas. The quest for a more humane form of state-sanctioned killing has proven to be an elusive and often deeply troubling endeavor. Yet even as the electric chair fades into history, the fundamental questions it raises remain as pressing as ever. What constitutes cruel and unusual punishment? Can the state ever truly carry out an execution in a humane manner? And at what cost do we pursue these dubious ideals of modern, efficient execution? These are the haunting questions that linger in the wake of Kemmler's grisly demise, a reminder that the pursuit of humane justice often comes at a terrible price. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.